I'm running out of space on this little table. It's good to see you all here this morning. It's good to have you with us if you're visiting with us. We're studying in the book of Exodus, and we've been looking at the plagues for the last couple of weeks on Egypt. And we got to the plague of darkness last week. I think we finished this plague right at the end, and so we kind of want to pick up where it was that we left off. This plagues came because Pharaoh wouldn't let Egypt go. They were enslaving the Israelites, and the Egyptians wouldn't let them go. Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. And God sent Moses to Egypt to have him bring his people out, to draw his people out of Egypt. And remember, Moses was hesitant, didn't want to go at first, but Moses finally comes, and he works these signs and wonders, and it hardens Pharaoh's heart. We've noticed in the text several times where God said, I will harden his heart, and Pharaoh hardens his heart after he gets relief from the various plagues. And the plague of locusts that precedes the plague of darkness is no different. He says that he's going to let him go. He tries to control the situation. We've noticed several times where Pharaoh tries to do that. He tries to save face by negotiating a settlement, right? With you can go, or the men can go, but you leave the little ones behind. You leave the women behind. You can go, but you leave your animals behind. And Moses says, no, when we go, we're bringing everybody. We're bringing everything with us, because we're going to sacrifice to the Lord, and we don't even know what we're going to sacrifice yet, and we need to bring everything with us. And so Pharaoh has tried to negotiate this and save face and look like he's still in control, but that's not working. In verse 24 of Exodus chapter 10, Pharaoh called to Moses and said, go serve the Lord, only let your flocks and your herds be kept back, let your little ones also go with you. But Moses said, you must give us sacrifices, burnt offerings, we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And so he says the livestock's going to go with us, so that there's no negotiating with God, right? God's conditions are, here's the deal. Here's what it is that I want you to do. Now you can either do it or you cannot do it, right? Pharaoh, I want you to let my people go. I want you to let them all go. I want you to let them take their livestock with them. I want you to let all of them leave. That's what God says. And Pharaoh is trying to negotiate that and say, well, I'll do this, but not that. I'll let your men go, but not the women and children. I'll let you can take the children, but leave the herds behind. Because if you leave your herds behind, you're gonna come back, right? You're not gonna stay away. So he's trying to negotiate. We can't do that. We can't negotiate with God. God says, here's what it is that I want you to do, right? In his plan of salvation. Can we say, well, I'm gonna check believe, right? It's easy for me to say I believe, right? So I'm going to check believe, but I'm not going to do the rest of it. Will that work? Can we negotiate our own deal with God that way? Pharaoh's trying to negotiate with God here, and God says, no, I'm the one who's in charge. I'm the one who's in control. And he's shown him that through all of these various different plagues. This plague of darkness, it comes upon the land. And it's at this end of plague of darkness that Pharaoh's trying to negotiate this. But this plague of darkness that we're talking about, there are several different deities, Egyptian deities, that are defeated by this. And we talked about these last week, I think. Osiris and Isis, who controlled the sun and the moon and the stars. Thoth, who was the arranger of the celestial system. Sekhmet, who was the goddess of artificial light, so they didn't even have artificial light available to them for the 3 days of darkness. Horus was at full strength in the noonday sun. And then their chief god is Ra, who is the sun god. And so none of these so-called deities, none of these so-called gods of the Egyptians could help them through this 3 days of darkness, where the darkness was so heavy that it could be felt, right? That they didn't leave their houses. They didn't go out for 3 days because of the complete darkness that they had in Egypt. But yet they had light in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were encamped. And so God made a distinction between his people and between the Egyptians, that they had light, but the Egyptians did not. Now at the end of this, right, Pharaoh's trying to control this. He says, you can go, but leave your flocks behind. And Moses says, no, we're going to bring everything out with us. We're not compromising, right? God's not compromising on this. And in verse 27, it says, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He would not let them go. And Pharaoh said to him, get away from me, take heed to yourself, and see my face no more, for in the day that you see my face you shall die. So Moses said, "You have spoken well. I will never see your face again." So at the end of this 3 days of darkness, when Moses takes the darkness away and Pharaoh still won't let them go, Pharaoh says, "Get away from me. I don't want to see you anymore. If I see you again, I'm going to kill you." And Moses says, "We're not going to see each other again." Now, Moses is going to announce the last plague, which is the death of the firstborn. He's going to announce the next plague here in chapter 11, but he's going to announce this last plague right here in this interaction that he has with Pharaoh, and they're not going to see each other again. Yes, sir?
Where is it that Moses supposedly saw God's face?
Well, he wanted to see God's face. That's in, I want to say that's in Exodus 34.
Showed him his backside.
Yeah. He hit him in the cleft of the rock and put his hand up. But yeah, he wanted to see his essential glory, right? He wanted to see his glory face to face. And God said, "You can't see that. You can't see that." But he hit him in the cleft of the rock, put his hand over him, passed by, and he allowed Moses to see.
Just that the wording here is a little strange. I'll never see your face again, as though he had seen it before.
Well, yeah, he's telling Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not going to see his face again.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a conversation between Moses and Pharaoh.
Moses answered, "Let it be as you have spoken. I will never see your face again." So that's Pharaoh saying that?
No, it's Moses speaking that to Pharaoh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why doesn't he say, "You will never see," instead of I?
Well,
He's never seen him ever.
Well, no, this seeing his face here in Exodus 10 is a conversation between Pharaoh and Moses. Pharaoh says, "Moses, I want you to get away from me. Take heed to yourself. You're not going to see my face." And Pharaoh says to Moses, "Moses, you're not going to see my face. You're not going to see Pharaoh's face anymore. You're not coming back in here again, right? And if you come back in here again, I'm going to kill you, right? You will die." And so this isn't God saying to Moses, "If you see my face, you'll die." This is Pharaoh saying to Moses, "If you see my face, right, again, you're going to die." So it's kind of like he's giving him till noon, right, to get out of get out of town, right, get out of Dodge. You got to get out of the palace now and not come back in here again. And Moses said, "You've spoken well. I'm not going to see your face again." So this is Moses and Pharaoh going back and forth here. And so Pharaoh says, "You're not going to see my face again." Moses says, "You're right, I'm not." And so Moses is going to announce the last plague. He's going to announce the plague, the death of the firstborn. But when that happens, he's not going to be called back into Pharaoh. Pharaoh's going to send word to Moses, "Go ahead and go." Right? He's going to drive him out of there, which is what God told Moses was going to happen. That it's going to be a heavy hand that's going to have to be on Egypt in order for Pharaoh to let you go. And when he lets you go, he's going to drive you out of there, right? And so that's what's going to happen here with the death of the firstborn. In verse 1 of chapter 11, the Lord said to Moses, "I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out of here altogether. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor and every woman from her neighbor articles of silver and articles of gold." It looks like what we have here at the beginning of chapter 11 is not necessarily a chronological account. We have derived, if you will, from Greek civilization. And the Greeks are very logical in their thinking. They want everything to be in chronological order, and we tend to be the same way as Western civilization. We tend to want to have things in chronological order. But the Hebrew mind is more of an Oriental mind, and we don't necessarily think a lot of times of Palestine being Oriental in nature, but the Orient Express ran from Paris to Istanbul, Turkey, which is further west than where Israel is located. It's north, but it's further west. But that was the Orient Express. It would bring you into this area. And so with an Oriental mind, I'm going to tell you a story, and it may not necessarily be in chronological order. And so what the Lord had spoken to Moses here to tell the people to do are things that God had spoken to Moses previously, and we're just getting it recorded here in the account of the story. Does that make sense? That it's not that Moses has left Pharaoh and he's gone and talked to the people and then he's going to come back and talk to Pharaoh. This is things that the Lord had spoken to Moses before, saying, while the darkness has taken place here, I'm going to bring one last plague, right? This is not the end yet. Afterward, he's going to let you go from here. He's going to drive you out altogether. And so have your people, right, have the Israelites ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and articles of gold. And the text says to borrow, right? or it says, well, let every man ask. And I think some texts say borrow there. They're not really borrowing these things. There's no intention that they're going to give them back. This is the way that the Israelites are going to plunder the Egyptians. And so we're in Exodus chapter 11, if you just came in. Exodus chapter 11, the first couple of verses here. In verse 3, the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people. And so Moses had gained some esteem here from the Egyptians, because what he is saying is taking place. What Moses is speaking is true, and what Pharaoh is doing, or what Pharaoh is saying, is destroying Egypt, because he's not giving in to what Moses is telling him he needs to do. And so he's very great in the land of Egypt, right? He achieved some esteem with the folks that are there, and the people as well. Thus Moses said in verse 4, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go into the midst of Egypt. So here in verse 4 we pick up, so those first 3 verses are kind of like a flashback. Here's what God had told Moses to do. Here's what Moses told the people to do. And so we just kind of get this little summary of what has taken place here in the first 3 verses. But verse 4 picks back up where we left off in chapter 10 and verse 29, where Moses says, you're right, I'm not going to see your face anymore. And Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go into the midst of Egypt. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals. And so he now announces this plague that's going to happen at midnight, right? So you're not going to see my face anymore, but at midnight tonight, here's what's going to happen. All of your firstborn are going to die, and it doesn't matter what your social status is, right? From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, well, he would be the highest person there in Egypt, to the firstborn of the female servant who's behind the handmill, the female servant that is there at the grinding wheel, right? The millstone. That would be kind of like the lowest position that you could have, right? If you were the slave that was in charge of being there at the millstone, that'd be like the lowest of the low, right? So we might say, from the CEO to the janitor, right? It's going to affect the firstborn of every family, of everybody that's here in Egypt. Nobody's going to get skipped because of social class. Even the firstborn of the animals. It says in verse 6, there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as was not like it before, now shall be like it again. But against none of the children of Israel shall a dog move its tongue, against man or beast, that you may know that the Lord does make a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. So while this is taking place in Egypt, while the firstborn are being killed, he says the dog's not even going to bark. Right? You're going to have all this wailing and crying going on because of the death of your firstborn. But over here in Goshen, where the Israelites are, not even a dog's going to be barking. Right? So peace and quiet that they're going to have there. And you'll know that God makes a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. So this isn't just going to be some sort of illness or some sort of plague that sets in, right, that people die from. This isn't some sort of natural cause. This is a supernatural thing that God is going to do. In verse 8 it says, and all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, and all the people who follow you. After that I will go out. And then he went out from Pharaoh in great anger. So Pharaoh is angry, right? Because he can't get any control over this. He can't save face. He can't negotiate a settlement. No, you can go, but leave your livestock behind. And Moses says, no, we're taking everything. And so Pharaoh's angry, and he says, you get out of here. If you come in here again, I'm going to kill you. And Moses says, I'm not coming back in here, but here's what's going to happen. The firstborn are going to die at midnight, and you're going to send your servants to me, and your servants are going to bow down to me. Pharaoh's servants, who are used to every day bowing down to Pharaoh and taking care of Pharaoh and taking care of Pharaoh's needs, they're going to come and they're going to bow down before Moses. Has Moses achieved great esteem in the land of Egypt? The Pharaoh's servants are going to come and bow down to him. They're going to recognize that he's speaking for God. So Moses and Aaron, it said, did all these wonders before Pharaoh. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land. So we have another summary statement here at the end of chapter 11 that says, Moses and Aaron came, and they did all these wonders. They did all these particular miracles, and in order to get the children of Israel to be able to leave the land of Egypt. And in every one of those occasions, Pharaoh hardened his heart up until this last one is going to be the one that's going to get the job done. But the death of the firstborn, it represents, again, another defeat of Egyptian gods, because the firstborn of all the Egyptians would be dedicated to their gods. And certainly when you think about Pharaoh being worshipped as a god, you're telling me that God's son is going to die, right? That Pharaoh thinking that he's a god, or the people thinking that Pharaoh's a god, well, his son's going to die too, and there's nothing that he can do about that. Comments or questions through chapter 11? So we have the announcement of the plague here. The plague doesn't necessarily take place yet. But after the death of the firstborn, it says the Pharaoh's going to drive them out of Egypt. He's going to let them go. They're going to be plundered by the Israelites, taking articles of silver and articles of gold from their neighbors. And to the victors, right, go the spoils of battle. They get the booty, right, or the treasure. And so it's like they've defeated Egypt without raising a hand, because God's the one who's done all of the fighting. Their firstborn, that it's going to die, it's important to them, right? Because that firstborn, that's a position of strength and power, isn't it? If you were the firstborn, you got the lion's share of the inheritance. You got 2/3 of the inheritance. You'd have that birthright, right? As far as the succession of kings, you'd be the next in line. And so that firstborn is an ultimate position there. That's who's going to die. It's not just any child, right? But it's going to be their firstborn child that's going to die in this. The fact that this is a defeat of the Egyptian gods, we see when we come over to Numbers chapter 33. So they departed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the day after the Passover. Children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians. For the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had killed among them, also on their gods. The Lord had executed judgments. And so there's judgments upon the gods of Egypt through all of these various different plagues. That God's just not doing this to show off. He's just not doing this so he can show how much power that he has. He wants them to know that he is the Lord, that he is God, and that all of these Egyptian deities aren't anything, right? That there's nothing to them. And that's what kind of makes the idea of idolatry so ridiculous, that the children of Israel would practice idolatry, right? Or that they would bring idols with them, or that they would worship idols. Makes that just a ridiculous thing when you look at what God has done to all of these Egyptian deities. I got to clean my notes up on this one of these days, because my notes are a mess. But so the plagues, the purpose of the plagues, there was a purpose to them, right? It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just for God to show off. It wasn't just for them to be able to see, hey, look what I can do. But there were several different things with regards to the purpose of the plagues. First, that they were acts of judgment against the Egyptians, right? The Egyptians had taken the Israelites and put them into slavery. They'd made them serve in hard bondage. In Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 20, it says that Egypt was like an iron furnace to them, something that was very difficult for them to have to deal with. And because of their mistreatment of God's people, well, God's executing judgment against the Egyptians for that. Secondly, we've seen in the text as we've gone through this, that the purpose of the plagues is so the Egyptians will know that Jehovah is God. Now, some of them are being able to see that. Moses has become highly esteemed. Some of Pharaoh's servants are going to come and bow down to him at the end of all of this. And so they're recognizing, right, that Jehovah is God. When the plague of the lice or the gnats came up, and the magician said, well, this isn't some sort of magic trick. This is the finger of God. They recognized that this was being done by God. And so that was part of the purpose of the plagues. So that God's name would be proclaimed throughout all the earth. In chapter 9, verses 15 and 16, we saw that if I had stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, then you would have been cut off from the earth. But indeed for this purpose I've raised you up, that I may show my power in you, that my name may be declared in all the earth. Because of what happens here in Egypt, this doesn't just stay, right? What happens in Egypt doesn't stay in Egypt. What happens in Egypt, they know about this in Jericho when the spies come in to Rahab. She says, we know what your God did to the Egyptians, right? And we're still talking about this. We've got it recorded for us, right? Several chapters that talk about what it is that's happened here in Egypt. God says, look, I could have just came in and wiped you all out and brought my people out. But I've done this for a purpose, so that all the world will know that I am God, that God's name will be proclaimed throughout all the world. Number 4, to demonstrate God's power over all. Right? God's got power over nations. He's got power over nature. There's nothing that God doesn't have power over. And the plagues demonstrate that God's got power over everything. We noticed natural things with regards to the Nile being turned to blood, right? And the insects and the frogs, but also their own bodies, right? That they receive boils. That He's got power over the celestial system, that there's darkness, right? That the sun's light doesn't work in that area for 3 days, but they've got light over in Israel, right? They got light over in Goshen. The plagues demonstrate God's intent to punish the wicked. Right? Those who don't do what it is that God wants to do, when God says, here's what it is that I want, and they dig their heels in, and over again, well, there's a punishment that's coming upon Pharaoh. There's a punishment that's coming upon Egypt for what it is that they've done that's been wicked against His people. And also, so the Israelites, right? Not just so that the Egyptians will know, but so that the Israelites will know. Because if you remember back in chapter 6, we talked about how God hadn't revealed His name, Yahweh, to them in earlier ages, but now He's revealing His name to them so that they will know who He is. They'll know who Yahweh is. They'll know who Jehovah is because of all the wonders that He's performing here. And so there was a purpose to all of these plagues that took place. Now, skeptics will say, well, that's, the things you're talking about, they're fantastic. There's no way that anybody could have turned the whole Nile River into blood. Are you serious? That to have darkness on the land like that you can't even light a candle, and they would say that this is ridiculous when you think about this, that this couldn't have taken place. Yes?
There's an Egyptian historian who chronicles almost all of this stuff that you find in Exodus, the plagues.
Mm-hmm.
He chronicles nearly all of it. I don't remember the guy's name, but it's not just in the Bible. It's an Egyptian historian chronicler who also.
Yeah. That's a good lead-in to what I've got next. So I don't know if you looked at my notes ahead of time, but it's a good lead-in to what I have next, because we have a non-biased, if you want, opinion on this. There's every Bible student's familiar with the plagues inflicted upon Egypt, commencing with the waters being turned to blood and ending with the death of the firstborn. Interestingly, an Egyptian papyrus written by one named Impuwer has been found, in which declared certain catastrophes, right? And so they found this papyrus. And this papyrus was written by this man Impuwer, who is dated back to the 19th dynasty of Egypt. And so what we've been talking about with the new Pharaoh coming in and not knowing Joseph, we talked about that potentially, if our dates are correct, being the beginning of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Well, here we've got a papyrus that's dated to the 19th century, so pretty close to this particular time period, by this man named Impuwer. And here's some of the things that he says in this particular papyrus. He says, plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. Well, that kind of sounds like that first plague, right? When the Nile was turned to blood and the water that was in their pots turned to blood and they had to dig to find new water. There's blood everywhere. There's plague throughout the land. There is blood everywhere. In another place, Impuwer says, trees are destroyed. There are no fruits, no herbs are to be found. Grain has perished on every side. That has perished, which yesterday was seen. The land is left to its weariness like the cutting of flax. So he says the trees are destroyed. Well, what happened to the trees? Well, we had great hailstones that came down and broke all the trees, right, in the hailstorm that they had. The locusts came in and they ate everything that was left, right? There's no fruits or grain has perished on every side. That which was there yesterday is now gone. So that would be something that would be sudden, right? And if you had that hailstorm to come in and then the locusts come in and they eat up everything that's left, well, that would seem to indicate the same sort of thing that Impuwer is talking about here, that lines up with what goes on in Exodus chapter 9, verses 25 and 31. He goes on to say, the land was in great affliction. I'm sorry. No. That's the impure word papyrus. There's something else, though. There's this stone that was found at El Arish. El Arish is in the area kind of in between Israel and Egypt, kind of right there on the border. And so there's a stone that's got some hieroglyphics that are on it. And on the hieroglyphics of this particular stone, this black granite stone, it reads, the land was in great affliction. Evil fell on this earth. There was a great upheaval in the residence. Nobody could leave the palace during 9 days. And during these 9 days of upheaval, there was such a tempest that neither men nor gods could see the faces of those beside them. So it talks about a tempest, like a storm. It talks about darkness, that they couldn't see those that were beside them. And that kind of lines up with what's written in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 22. That there was darkness so heavy that they didn't leave their house, and they couldn't see anyone else beside them. They couldn't see their hand in front of their face. And so, again, this seems to line up with what is there in Exodus chapter 10 for us. And so there's some evidence, archaeological evidence, and other evidence that these plagues actually did take place in the way that they are recorded, and that this is just not some sort of fantastical make-believe that somebody came up with after the fact. Comments or questions on these things? Yes.
Don't you think the Egyptians were ready, the people were ready for the Israelites to leave long before Pharaoh was around?
Yeah, they were, because when he says, you can go who are men, but leave everyone else behind, his servants had said to him, don't you understand that Egypt is destroyed? Let them go. How long are you going to continue this, right? You need to let them go. So yeah, there were folks in Egypt that were thinking that, we needed to let Moses and his people go long before this.
And they bought their escape with the gold.
Yeah. Well, maybe they want to curry favor, because we don't want you angry with us. Here, take this, go, take whatever you want and just get out of it, just go ahead and go. I've read some commentaries where they said it's sort of like payment for all the work that they did while they were slaves. I guess you could tend to look at it that way, but I tend to look at it more of they're plundering the enemy after they've defeated them, because the spoils of victory, right, go to the victors. And so they're going to take the spoils of victory with them. Now, all those things that they're going to take, they're going to use when they build the tabernacle. Right? So all those items of silver and gold they're going to use for God's glory. And so God's going to get the glory for that, not the people themselves.
That was very, tons of gold and silver that they put.
Yeah.
So that influence,
Yeah.
did all the overlays, that they had to have all the solid gold.
Yeah, when we talk about the items of the tabernacle and then later especially the temple, right, we're talking a lot of gold that would have been used in that. So they're not coming out empty-handed when they leave. God's going to make sure they've got what they need to take care of them. Now, they're not going to think they have what they need when they come out, and they're going to complain about that, but God is there to take care of their needs for them. That's the end of my PowerPoint, but it's not the end of our lesson. We've still got some time. So in chapter 12, now in between the announcement of the death of the firstborn and the actual death of the firstborn, we've got the stipulations of the Passover, that there's going to be something that the Israelites need to do in order to protect themselves from this last plague. It says in chapter 12, verse 1, Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel. On the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall take your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. They shall take some of this blood and put it on the 2 doorposts on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. They shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw nor boiled, at all with water, but roast it in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it with your belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. So you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. And so they receive these instructions for the Passover. Now, again, I think we see God's all-knowingness here, right? We see his omniscience in this, in what it is that he's telling them to do, because he's given them these instructions about what to do for this Passover lamb. And when does he say, what day of the month are they to put this lamb up? They're going to kill it on the 14th day of the month, but what day are they supposed to put it aside?
10th.
On the 10th day of the month. They're going to set it aside on the 10th day of the month, but they're not going to kill it until the 14th day. Well, the 14th day is this evening, right, when the plague's going to hit Egypt and the firstborn are going to die that Moses has announced back in chapter 11. That's the 14th day. The prior 3 days, the Egyptians have been in darkness, not able to see anything. So if today's the 14th day that we're going to kill that lamb tonight, right, because the last plague is coming tonight, there's been 3 days of darkness, right, which is part of the 14th, maybe the 13th and the 12th, or you might say the 13th, the 12th, and the 11th, however you want to calculate that. God told them before the darkness struck to put the lamb aside for this Passover meal. God knew what was going to happen, right? God made plans for them ahead of time for what it was that they were going to need to do in order to worship him and in order to have themselves be saved from the 10th plague. And I think that's cool when you think about that, the timing of all of that God told them, all right, you put this lamb aside. They don't know what for yet, right? But you put this lamb aside on the 14th day, you're going to kill this. It's going to be a Passover. You're going to eat this in haste, right? You're going to be dressed ready to go when you eat this, because you're not going to have a lot of time afterwards. Right? You're not going to have time to do the dishes. You're not going to have time to clean up. You're not going to have time for leftovers. You don't leave any of this left over until the morning. You eat it that night. You burn up what's left. You do it with your belt on and your shoes on and your staff in your hand, and you're ready to go.
Fed and ready to go. Fed for the journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And so to me, I just think that's cool, the way that God kind of pre-plans that out, right? That he kind of has foresight to see all of that. So he tells them, here's how you shall eat it, right? And so there's instructions for how it is that they are to eat that particular lamb, that they are to roast it in fire, that they're not to boil it, they're not to eat it raw, that they're to eat it with unleavened bread in verse 8 and with bitter herbs. The unleavened bread would be that, the idea that you're leaving in haste. You don't have time to prepare. You don't have time to leaven your bread to get it to rise, right? And then the bitter herbs would represent the bitter life that they had here in Egypt. And so he gives them instructions for how it is that they are to eat that. But notice also that they are to take the blood from that lamb that they kill. They're to put it on the 2 doorposts, and they're to put it on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. That's important that they do that. And so he says, you shall eat it in haste, right? It's the Lord's Passover. And this represents something. In verse 12, he says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. He's going to execute judgment on what? Against all the gods of Egypt, right? He's going to defeat all the gods of Egypt by killing the firstborn, and through all of the plagues that God has brought upon Egypt. So he's going to execute judgment. He says, the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you, nor to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So the blood was for a purpose. The blood was that when God sees the blood that's there, that he's going to pass over them. He's not going to take their life. Blood was an atoning sacrifice. Right? It was a substitution. So rather than the firstborn of Israel dying, because the lamb is going to be slaughtered and the lamb's blood is going to be put over, that's going to keep them safe from the destroyer, that they're not going to be killed when he comes in to execute this plague upon Egypt. Yes?
Does that apply also to the firstborn animals that belong to slaves to the Jews, that they will die also?
No.
I thought not.
Yeah, because he says not even a dog's going to wag its tongue, right? So there isn't going to be any of this that's going to happen in the land of Goshen. But they need to do this in order to protect themselves. They need to put this blood. It wasn't enough for them. They could have said, okay, well, I put the lamb aside on the 10th day. We killed it on the 14th. We roasted it in fire. We ate all of it. We didn't leave anything until midnight. But what if they didn't do what they were supposed to do with the blood? The lamb died for them, right? As a substitution. The lamb died for them. They followed all the other instructions, but they didn't apply the blood. Would that have worked? Blood had to be there, right? In order for the angel of the Lord, in order for the death angel, whatever you want to say, that's doing this, the blood needed to be applied. And it's the same with us today, right? We say, well, Jesus died for the sins of all mankind. Yes, he did. He shed his blood so that everybody could be saved. Yes, he did. But if you don't apply the blood, if you don't make contact with the blood of Christ and apply it, it doesn't do you any good. Right? It's a sacrifice. It's a substitutionary sacrifice that's very much parallel with the substitutionary sacrifice that Jesus makes on our behalf, that he died for us. He's the Lamb of God, John the Baptizer said, who takes away sins of the world. So this Passover lamb is a parallel. It's a foreshadowing of what Jesus is going to do. The blood was important. In Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 11, God told them, the life, you don't eat blood. You don't eat the blood. When you kill something, when you have an animal, when you have food, you drain the blood out of it first. You don't eat the blood because the life is in the blood, and I've given it to you to make atonement on the altar because the life is in the blood. Their life that night was in the blood that they had to put on the doorposts and on the lintel of their house. Our life is in the blood of Jesus. We've got to have the blood of Jesus if we're going to have life, if we're going to live spiritually. Comments or questions?
There's never been a salvation given without our part. Nowhere in the Old Testament, New Testament, can you have salvation without your part.
We've got to do we've got to do our part. We've got to be obedient, right?
Noah had to get on the boat, and you had to build a boat, get on the boat. You got to do something for your salvation. People want to say, hey, all you got to do is set it in your heart. But I've never seen salvation given without our part.
Yeah, there's something we have to do. Yes, sir.
Was there not also, south of the land of Goshen, a large Jewish settlement along the Nile as well? I don't remember the name of what it was supposed to be, but it gives indication of a hasty leaving.
It does.
That place.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Do you know the name of it?
I did, but I don't recall the name of it either. But I know what you're talking about. Yeah, there's when they did excavations of these cities that are there, they found beneath there a Canaanite group that is clearly Canaanite, that's dated to this time period, that looks like they suddenly picked up and left, or that they're just suddenly gone from that area. And they also noticed in the land of Egypt itself, they noticed in this particular time period from the digs that they've done, a lot of infants, a lot of young children that look like they died suddenly too. So there's some archaeological evidence that goes along with what's happening here. But God's instituting this Passover here for them, that they are to do this in their future generations. That this is going to change their world, if you will, right? Because this is going to be the first month. So within their religious calendar, this first month, this month of Abib here is going to be the first month on their religious calendar. And so on this first month, they are to, on the 14th day, partake of this particular Passover. Right? They're to do this in perpetuity, to remember this particular night, to remember God bringing them out of the land of Egypt, and that he passed over their houses. And so they are to continue to do this. This falls in the March-April time period. It doesn't always, sometimes it's in March, sometimes it's in April, because when you go by, their calendar, it's a little different than ours. But it falls in the March-April time period. That's when Passover is, and that's when Jesus died. Right? Jesus died on the cross at the time of Passover. And so it's going to be that same time period, because he wanted to eat the Passover meal with his disciples before he was killed. Now, they have with us, as we'll see, this Feast of Unleavened Bread that lasts for 7 days. And there's some implications from that as well. But this equal to the time period. So whenever you look at your calendar now, you might see Passover that is there on the calendar around the time that folks celebrate Easter. So it's in that same general time period. Passover can be any day of the week. It's not a particular day of the week, but it's always the 14th, just like, my birthday was a couple days ago, and it's not a particular day of the week. It just happened to work out that it was Friday this year. But your birthday is that same date, but it's not always the same day of the week. Well, that's how Passover is. It's the 14th day of that first month, and so it can be on a Sabbath day. It can be on a Saturday. It could be any day of the week. So it's not tied to any one particular day of the week. So he says in verse 14, "This day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance." So they are to continue to do this throughout their generations, that they are to observe this Passover, because it reminds them of what it is that happened to them. They can use it as a teaching moment with their children to say, when the children say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we every year having this Passover meal? Why are we having this lamb, and why are we doing it in this particular way? Well, they can use it as a teaching moment to teach our children, here's what the Lord has done for us. Yes?
Yeah, I'm also struck by verse 10 where it says, "And you shall not leave any of it until morning leave any of it over until morning, but whatever is left in the morning you shall burn with fire." There will be nothing else left in the house. But I think there's a verse that describes the suffering that the Egyptians would suffer. Every house would have someone dead in it, almost something like that.
Yeah.
I can imagine the Egyptians going to their houses in Goshen, seeing the blood on the door, but looking in, and there's no death in it. But they had a death,
Yeah.
which is parallel to Jesus' tomb. It was a borrowed tomb, empty tomb, and you look in there, and there's no death in the tomb of Jesus. The Passover lamb gave them life and energy to get up and leave. And so all those things work together to bring back what Jesus has done for us spiritually.
Yeah. Yeah, he's our lamb, right? And he has died so that we can have life. And that lamb that they killed and they ate, the blood of that lamb gave them life, that they didn't have to suffer the death of the firstborn like those in Egypt did. Thanks for your attention and your comments.